Yeah, but how do you disarm the rest of Hamas? We're not sure how many are left, but certainly thousands of them, when they're embedded now in refugee camps amongst hundreds of thousands of civilians, millions of them.
Who brought up Nazi Germany as a kind of an analogy for what's happening in the Mideast, and it's absolutely intent on one issue only, to just annihilate Israel and to kill all the Jews. And in their charter, Hamas has a provision that says it is against Islamic law to even negotiate with Israel, except as a ruse. The Israeli government and Israelis themselves are very, very critical of President Netanyahu and absolutely dismayed and disgusted.
And here's where I would put your slight moral, I would argue, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would say that this is where there's a slight inconsistency in your moral worldview of these things, because when it comes to Israel, whose leader, Netanyahu, is facing corruption charges, unlike Zelensky, and whose leader authorized payments of billions and billions of dollars to Hamas because it suited him to keep the Palestinian Authority and Hamas at loggerheads with each other, that you support without any equivocation continued ongoing support for that government and Netanyahu and what he's doing when much of the world is enraged by the scale of the response to October the 7th. And I would simply say that there's an inconsistency there. You don't seem bothered about Israel corruption or about the billions of dollars being funneled to Hamas to prop them up. And yet that's the kind of stick you want to beat Ukraine with, where the leader is not facing corruption charges. What do you say?
Let me answer your first point first. I supported the attack on Tora Bora to get rid of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. I did not support the takeover of Afghanistan. And I think that there was an appropriate response to 9/11, and the U.S. response under President Bush and Vice President Cheney and Rumsfeld was a catastrophe for our country, for the world, for our moral standing around the world, and for our strength. I'm not a supporter of President Netanyahu. I've been a longtime critic of him. I was critical of his judicial reforms. I'm not a co-signing anything for Likud or President Netanyahu. The Israeli government and Israelis themselves are very, very critical of President Netanyahu and absolutely dismayed and disgusted with his authorization of the $1.4 billion payment from Qatar to Hamas, and the reasons for he did it, which he was explicit about, to strengthen Hamas, to make to make it peace impossible or any kind of conciliation with the Palestinian Authority impossible. Most people in Israel are not supportive of President Netanyahu, but they are supportive of this policy. There's a unity government, as you know, in Israel that is all sides. And there's a war cabinet that is represented by all sides, and they support the need to get rid of Hamas. And
one of that war cabinet the war cabinet is 3 people, and one of them just resigned. So they're not all in agreement, are they?
Yeah. Well, no, but Benny Gantz did not resign in protest of any specific war policy.
Well, no, he resigned because he doesn't believe there's any end game. There's no end game, he says. There's no plan for the day after the war. Well, and he's right, there isn't.
Well, I agree there should be an end plan as well. So, but that's not the question. The question is, do we need to disarm? Does Israel need to disarm Hamas before a ceasefire or get the hostages back? And I would say the hostages have to be returned and Hamas has to be disarmed. Or else, how can you have a peace? I don't know.
How do you disarm? How do you disarm?
But
how do you disarm the rest of Hamas? We're not sure how many are left, but certainly thousands of them, when they're embedded now in refugee camps amongst hundreds of thousands of civilians, millions of them. And so every time you launch an offensive against them, as we saw with the apparent targeted attack on 2 Hamas terrorists in the Rafah camp, and as you saw with the rescue of these hostages, one of them led to 50 civilians being killed. The other ones led to, depending which numbers you believe, anything between 100 and 274 people being killed. So at what point does this desperation to eliminate the last members of Hamas get overtaken by the sheer volume of civilians being killed in the process, which I cannot believe will do anything longer term than foment the ideology that drove Hamas in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking a lot of questions, and I'd like you to give me time to answer them.
Sure.
And you could ask the same. You brought up Nazi Germany as a kind of an analogy for what's happening in the Mideast, and in 1945 or 44 at Casablanca, Churchill and Roosevelt had an argument because Roosevelt said we have to denazify Germany. And if we don't denazify Germany, it is going to, the Nazis are going to rise up and do the same thing again. Churchill did not want an unconditional surrender for the Nazis. He said, we'll have to kill too many civilians to do that, and everybody will fight for the death. But Roosevelt won that argument. We killed about 2 million Germans during World War II in order to get into Berlin and denazify it. Today, Germany is the richest country in Europe. It's one of the most powerful economies in the world. I think it's the fourth most powerful. And nobody's scared of Germany because it's a peaceful country. And today, Hamas, which is authoritarian control of, hasn't won an election in 16 years, of Gaza, is a corporate kleptocracy, and it's absolutely intent on one issue only, to just annihilate Israel and to kill all the Jews. And in their charter, Hamas has a provision that says it is against Islamic law to even negotiate with Israel except as a ruse. So I don't see how people who are saying, well, you should have a ceasefire, then what? And what you've rewarded Hamas for taking hostages, and they're going to keep taking hostages to get more and more advantage. And this is, by the way, the fifth ceasefire. On October 7th, they broke a ceasefire.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
So are you going to go back to that status quo?
Well, I don't think there's any future. I don't think you can have any future. I don't think you can have any future there with Hamas retaining any form of power whatsoever. Nor do I think Netanyahu.
I agree.
Nor do I think Netanyahu is a person that's going to bring peace to that region at all.
No, neither do I. You and I are agreed on that.
Well, there we go. You see?